Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell. And in this little slideshow, we're going to draw the nitrogen cycle. So we're going to have our paper turned the long way across on our desk and kind of put in some land here like we did before in our last two cycles. And I'm going to put in a little bit of water on the edge here. And we're going to start with nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. In our last picture, we did carbon cycle, and carbon exists as carbon dioxide gas. This is nitrogen cycle. And nitrogen exists in gas form as two nitrogen atoms joined together. Remember when we did photosynthesis and our water molecule split and those two oxygen atoms kind of buddied up and made O2 gas that left the plant and went out to the atmosphere. Nitrogen exists as what we call a diatomic gas. Also, it's two atoms of nitrogen hooked together to make nitrogen gas. So I'm going to label this gas in the atmosphere again. And so I'm going to have you put a volcano over here. I'm going to add a little lava to my volcano here, like we did before. You can put some fire in a little bit, fire and some smoke. We're going to make this an active volcano. And we're going to start with nitrogen now in our atmosphere. And I'm going to have you, just like we did in our last picture, we're going to put in a little plant. Only this time we're going to put in a special kind of plant. So don't go too near the edge because we want to put something underneath our plant here. And we're going to put in a plant called a legume. We have legumes in South Dakota. Soybeans are legumes. Alfalfa is legumes. Peanuts are legumes. And legumes are a special kind of plant. So think soybeans. They're kind of low to the ground and kind of leafy. So I'm going to make a little plant here. And I'm going to label this legume. And legumes are special plants because they have symbiotic relationships with special kind of bacteria. So I'm going to put in some roots here on my little legume plant. And pick a color that's going to stand out now on your roots. And we're going to put these are called nodules. And inside these nodules there are bacteria that live. So keep your color going for bacteria here and put your label on. And we're going to put bacteria in the soil. And there are certain kinds of bacteria that have a special, remember we talked about symbiotic relationships. This is a mutualism. Plant is doing photosynthesis and making food, which it shares with the bacteria. And the bacteria are doing something that also helps the plant, which is taking nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil in a form that the plant can use. So we're going to take nitrogen gas. And the plant isn't doing this now. It's the bacteria that are doing this. So bacteria in the soil are going to take nitrogen gas and turn it into something called ammonia. The chemical formula for ammonia is NH3. I'm going to put ammonia into the soil. And then now that nitrogen gas has been turned into a form that the plants can use. So plants are going to take up the ammonia, take it up. This is called uptake. And now they can use that nitrogen that's in the ammonia to build their molecules that need nitrogen. Think about, we talked about nitrogen bases in DNA and RNA that requires nitrogen. Think about proteins. Remember they have an amino group, that NH group that's makes the amino acids, part of the amino acids that are part of proteins. Those have nitrogen in them. So the plant is doing photosynthesis and using carbon dioxide to make sugar, but it needs nitrogen from the soil to make some of those other molecules that have nitrogen in them. So nitrogen gas, bacteria in the soil are going to break those bonds between the nitrogen atoms and put that into the soil as ammonia. I'm going to pass to an organism. I'm going to make a little bunny rabbit again here. We did last time. And bunny rabbit is going to get nitrogen by eating the plants. And even though there's nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, as our animals are breathing and taking in that air, you don't have the chemistry, you don't have the enzymes and metabolism that allow you to take that nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and use it in your bodies. The only way that we get nitrogen is from the food that we eat. So I'm going to put a little arrow here. And you know how when we have a sign, someone is telling us, they write it on the sign of whatever it is they don't want you to do, and then they put that little circle with the slash mark through it. So I'm going to make a connection here between my animal and nitrogen in the atmosphere. And then I'm going to put that little, doesn't work that way. Don't do that. Animals do not get their nitrogen from the air that we breathe. Even though our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, almost 80% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas, we don't have the ability to take those gas molecules out of the air and use them in our bodies. We get the nitrogen from the food that we eat. So I'm going to say, no way, this doesn't happen. Animals can't take nitrogen directly out of the atmosphere. And plants can't do it either. We can't use that nitrogen gas. Plants can only take up nitrogen in the form of ammonia with through their roots. So nitrogen is going to pass into our plant and pass to the consumers that eat the plant, and then returns to our soil now, just like in our carbon cycle. When we have death, or the animal goes to the bathroom, makes waste, in this case nitrogen waste, we're talking about urine now rather than feces, goes back into the soil, returns to the soil. When the animal dies, and those little decomposers are breaking down those molecules. Let's add the word decomposers here. Putting those nutrients back into our soil. And they go back as ammonia and another form of nitrogen in the soil, which is called nitrates and nitrites. And that's when we talk about nitrogen in our soil, we're talking about these forms, the ammonia, the nitrates and nitrites. There's another way that nitrates and nitrites get into the soil, and that is there are bacteria, just like we had before associated with our legumes. There are bacteria in the soil that can take ammonia, the nitrogen form called ammonia, and turn it into nitrates and nitrites. And then there are also bacteria that complete the cycle. Remember, we had nitrogen gas being put into the soil, and we need a way for that to go back into our atmosphere. So there are also bacteria that live in the soil. And these are different than the nitrogen fixers that are putting the nitrogen into the soil. Bacteria that live in the soil that are sending the nitrates and nitrites back to nitrogen gas. So the only way that really we're living on the planet and have the nitrogen we need to make all those molecules we use that have nitrogen in them is because of these bacteria that help us by taking the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, putting into the soil, and then keeping the cycle going by returning it back to the atmosphere again. So let's put some vocab on. This process of taking gas and turning it into ammonia is called nitrogen fixation. We're fixing the nitrogen into a form that plants and other living things can use. And then returning it back to the atmosphere is called denitrification. We're undoing that nitrogen fixation. We're sending those molecules back as nitrogen gas. Okay. One of the other ways that we can take nitrogen out of our atmosphere, and remember that bond between these nitrogen atoms is pretty strong. We need enzymes to break them apart. We had bacteria that can do that. Also, volcanic activity is pretty powerful, can take nitrogen gas and put it back into the soil. in the form of those nitrates. When we talk about nitrogen in the soil, we're talking about ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites form of nitrogen that's in the soil. So volcanic activity. Remember our volcanoes in our last cycle put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But this volcano, when the volcanoes erupt, they're also putting nitrogen back into the soil. The other thing that's really powerful that can take nitrogen gas and put it into the soil that's available for plants is lightning. So we're going to do a little lightning here. And lightning can also take nitrogen gas and put it back into the soil in a form that plants can use. Lightning. Add lightning to our picture. Okay. We have another way for nitrogen to get in the soil, and that's caused by humans. And think farmers. One of the things that farmers do to help their plants grow better is to put nitrogen in the soil in the form of fertilizer. So I'm going to add a little farmer here. I'm going to give him a little tractor. Maybe I want to do, let's do John Deere green here. And give him some video. And if you think about now, here's our little farmer. And farmers put fertilizer in the form, if you ever watch the farmer driving that big tank around, the fertilizer tank, it says ammonia on the side. Farmers put fertilizer into the soil by adding ammonia. So I'm going to put fertilizer here. And that's one of the reasons that farmers rotate their crops when they change between corn and soybeans. Remember, corn is not a legume and it requires fertilizer to make it grow. And if you grow corn for a really long time, it's actually removing the nutrients out of the soil and not really putting them back again. But if the farmer alternates with legumes, growing soybeans in between the corn, 1 year corn, 1 year soybeans, the soybeans are legumes and they're actually putting nitrogen back into the soil when the farmer grows the soybeans. Okay, so we kind of got a cycle going here on the land here, between land and atmosphere. We have gas, nitrogen gas into the soil, and then returning to the atmosphere again. We haven't really talked too much, gotten very much in our picture about nitrogen in the water. So think about, we talked about how come lakes turn green in South Dakota in the summertime, and that's because when we have runoff, I'm going to put some runoff here, through the nitrogen that's in the soil, through the nitrates, through the ammonia, it's going to pick those up as well. I'll put runoff here, and carry them into the nearest water supply. Comes from animal waste, comes from fertilizer, comes from all those nitrogen compounds that are in the soil, and it's going to put nitrogen into our lake. Nitrites, ammonia, animal waste, they go into the water, and that provides food for the plants. And the reason lakes go green in South Dakota in the summertime is algae. Maybe we want to put some algae in our picture. And remember, nitrogen is food for the algae. A-L-G-A-E. We have algae in our lake. And they're going to, producers are going to pick up that nitrogen from that's called uptake, and use it to build their molecules, build their proteins, build their DNA. And then when nitrogen is going to get passed from the plants to the consumers when they eat the plants. Remember, you can't take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. You don't have the enzymes to do that. You don't have the chemistry, but bacteria can put that into the soil, and then that gets into the water plants and into the water animals and becomes part of the food chain. And then when those organisms die, their nutrients are going back into the water. When they have death or make waste, remember this is nitrogen waste, though, think urine. nitrogen waste. It puts those nitrogen molecules back into the water, and they can be used again by another organism. Some of those organisms are going to decompose. Remember, our decomposers are helping us return those nutrients to the ecosystem. So I'm going to add some decomposers here. Decomposers put those nutrients back into the thing about the dead bodies falling to the bottom and breaking down. They become part of the land again. That's part of the rock cycle again. We're going back to soil, going back to rock. I think that takes care of our nitrogen cycle. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for our last cycle, which is phosphorus cycle.